This time we have a very big support from our co-host UNICEF Thailand. So big thanks to UNICEF Thailand to make this happen. We have a great honor, we have a great opportunity to have Dr. Taskeen Adam, Associate Manager, Open Development and Education, EdTech Hub, England, as our keynote speaker. Today, Professor Taskeen will share the vision and experience toward the social change trend related to the approaches of designing justice-oriented MOOCs. Wow. So everyone, please join me to welcome Dr. Taskeen Adam. Dr. Adam, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Hello to everyone. Good
Hello.
morning, good evening from wherever you are. Thank you so much for having me today. I am really honored to be invited to speak today. So I can just tell you a little bit about myself. My background, my research has been in looking at MOOCs and how they can support the most marginalized groups in South Africa. So I'm from South Africa. And today I'll be presenting on approaches to designing justice-oriented MOOCs, which arises from my research topic. Now, before I start these presentations, I often like to point out my positionality in the situation because I talk about topics like social justice and inequality. And so to give you just a little share about my background, I find myself on the sides of both ends. So in some contexts, I'm part of marginalized groups or previously marginalized groups within South Africa and sort of the apartheid regime and certain groups being marginalized. But on the other hand, I've had opportunities to study abroad in the UK. I've studied at the University of Cambridge. And of course, that gives me some leverage and advantage and social network. And so I always like to bring that context together because I can see both sides of the coin. So without further ado, let me jump into my presentation. So today I will be talking about the background of my research and looking at sort of the educational context that I speak from and the different conceptual frameworks that I've used to understand what justice-oriented MOOCs could look like. I'll then take you through a framework of 4 levels that I've outlined that can actually help someone to create justice-oriented MOOCs. And then I'll give you 4 takeaways at the end. So to jump straight in, as I mentioned, I'm from South Africa, and South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient in the world, which means that we have the highest inequality, the highest difference between the rich people and the poor people. And this is the landscape that I conducted my research in, where some people have resources and others don't. So when the pandemic hit, there was so many news articles about how COVID was impacting education. My favorite statement on the screen, just to put up a few, was no to just opening schools, yes to opening them justly. So this was the idea of, the layers of inequality when the pandemic hit, how that impacted different schools differently. And so on the one side, we had schools, whether it's universities or primary or secondary, one set of a more wealthier group were talking about things like, how do we do synchronous teaching methods online? What proctoring service do we use? What are the digital pedagogies? Should we use Zoom? Should we use Teams? These are the types of questions that were being asked. But on the other end of the spectrum, where people were less fortunate, it was about, do we even have one device in our home to use? And if we have one device, who is going to use it? Is the mom going to use it to do work? Is the kid going to use it to access the school class? In many schools, there was also kids go to schools and they get access to food through the free school feeding programs. And so if there's no schools, what happens there? And so you see, there was this really like 2 different worlds that I had to deal with within my work as people were talking about the impacts of COVID and shifting to online teaching and learning. So bringing that context into MOOCs and open education, in my research, I covered different backgrounds in terms of what are these inequalities. And so some of them are highlighted on the screen. And if you look at open repositories of open educational resources, for example, most of them come from Europe and the global north, and 1% come from Africa. I actually don't know the statistics of how it would be from Thailand or from the East, but it would be interesting to compare that dynamic as well. When we looked at the presenters in these, and we looked at the MOOC producers who are Black on Coursera and FutureLearn, the percentage was really tiny, 1.7 and 1.1. And similarly, when we looked at the number of courses on Coursera, and this was in 2019, that looked at, in 2017, that looked at how many courses were developed from the Global South, it was 7.3% in comparison. So that kind of sets the background. And now I want to introduce a few different ideas about ways that the open educational movement, OEM, and MOOCs have been critiqued within the space. So first you have the neoliberal critique. And this is the idea that MOOCs can often use a term called open washing. So the language of openness can be used, but the free tenets of openness are not really baked into the model. So beyond just having the course for free, there might be some paid components, or the content might not be licensed to be reused. So there's many aspects of this that show that, well, it might look like open, but then when you actually, open the bonnet and look inside, it's not actually that open. The next one is the social injustice critique. And that argues that the idea of open in and of itself is not good. You actually have to strive for equity to make something equal. So just saying, like, let's say you have a course and you say, hey, my course is open, doesn't mean that everyone can access it in the world. As we know, different people have different levels of access, right? And have different constraining factors. They might have a full-time job. They might have many kids to feed. So it's not really equitable just because you say something is open. Now, the third one is the neoliberal critique. And this understanding takes that social injustice critique just a little further and looks at the geopolitical dynamics that I've mentioned. And this idea that openness can be inherently and universally a good thing. And so sometimes we have to look at when openness might actually be harmful. For example, if content is always developed in the global north and global south becomes consumers of global north content rather than building their local knowledges. And this is what I love about Thailand, because you have so much of local MOOCs being developed. So it's talking about that skewed geopolitics of knowledge within these open and global platforms. So with digital neocolonialism, which is what my research looks at, we look at hegemonic powers. But so hegemonic is basically those, the imbalances, those who are in power. And normally when we talk about colonialism, we think of empires and how some parts of the world controlled others. But in digital neocolonialism, this can shift to corporates and institutes. And it might not be economic, but it can also be social and cultural hegemony. So shaping how you think, how you appear, how do you define success? What do you think are the right mannerisms? Those are the types of things that you think that are shaped by social hegemony. Now, the idea here also in digital neocolonialism is the idea of calculative thinking becomes the main form of thinking. So, anything that can be converted into a data point and measured and assessed then becomes the thing that is important. And we look at things that can't really be assessed. We don't focus on those enough. So similar concepts to that might be cyber colonialism, data colonialism, techno-capitalism. These sorts of theories fall under those topics. So when we look at MOOCs, there can be various colonial elements embedded into them. And the first one is these globalizing education aspects. So the idea here is that we can create something in one part of the world, which is normally in the global north, and that can be then disseminated to all parts of the world. And that understanding that education that comes from the global north might be the best and worthy of all global participants going to it. But then when you come to something like a region, whether it's South Africa or Thailand or India, we call those regional, right? Because those are only relevant for those contexts. But when we create something in the US or the UK, that's relevant to everyone. So those type of dynamics. Then you get the sort of epistemological assumptions. So how you understand the world is shaped by these courses, because education is political. Whatever you teach in education means that is how you're going to shape the worldview of someone. So we really need to be conscious of the content that goes into it. Then with MOOCs, you have dominant languages, where most of the MOOCs have been developed in English, and I think Mandarin is actually the second now, and you have Spanish and French. But there's also large languages like Hindi or Swahili that come from the global south, or Hausa, for example, that don't have as much content, even though they have probably large numbers of people around the world who can speak them. You then have the core to periphery implementation, which is basically like that, the source of knowledge set in almost a handful of global north institutes, whether it's like the Cambridges and the Harvards, or like those sorts of institutes that then disseminate these learnings across the world. And then the second to last one is colonial logic, which then looks at the algorithms that are built in, that looks at, for example, learning paths and what is the appropriate learning path that a learner should choose. There's been a lot of research about looking at how to support different types of learners on MOOCs through AI. And we have to look at the colonial logic embedded in that. And the last one is adverse incorporation. So this idea that as learning goes online and youth are trapped in their learning experiences, do they really understand what they're signing up for when they agree to this? And in many global South institutes, like, do they really have an option? Like, if the only quality education they can receive is through an online education platform, do they really have an option to opt out if they wanted to? So within my research, I brought all of these different thoughts to 3 different levels. So first, it is the material injustices that is often spoken about, the differences between infrastructure and resources, and geographic location and social economics. And then you have cultural epistemic injustices, which looks at the knowledge elements. So the differing histories, values, narratives, worldviews that are promoted in MOOCs and those which are not. And then you have geopolitical injustices, political and geopolitical. And this looks at race, class, sexuality, gender, geographic, spirituality, and looks at the imbalances that come from these different groups. And all of this was drawn on from 2 different angles. So one school of thought looks at social justice frameworks. These actually originate mostly in the global north and the understanding of justice, and decoloniality frameworks, which are rooted from the global south, specifically India, South Africa, or Africa, and Brazil have been the main contributors to decoloniality frameworks. So bringing that back to MOOCs, when I reviewed, my research reviewed different types of MOOCs, and 4 categories arose. So the first one is MOOCs that could perpetuate injustices. And the idea here is that a MOOC could give a specific, for example, a historical narrative that excludes other views and viewpoints and presents that as the sole truth. So sometimes this could even be done inadvertently if you leave out, for example, a specific perspective of history from, for example, the saying that, history is written by the victor. So you always have these stories of who is the victor and who isn't. So then you have MOOCs that are based on open philosophies, but they might not address injustices. And the idea here is that you could have MOOC. This happens a lot in sort of the techie computer science sort of space, where we're like, yes, we're going to use an open source platform and this open source software. But that looks at technological openness. It doesn't look at culture or linguistic barriers to access. It doesn't look at equity. And so the idea, that's the part of the open washing, where you could use the word open, but open doesn't mean it's actually accessible to everyone. We then look at MOOCs that strive for justice, but not necessarily through including the marginalized group as its target group. And so here, it could be a MOOC that, for example, empowers the journalist or an activist, or an NGO worker, or even an engineer that is trying to build a bridge sustainably, for example, or a journalist that's trying to uncover a history. So they are not the group that is marginalized, but they are the ones that are going to support them. And so you are striving for justice by empowering them with the skills and tools. The last one is MOOCs that are justice oriented and include marginalized groups. So example here is, for example, if you design a MOOC that looks specifically at supporting teachers in rural locations, or nurses that are trying to do something, who are actually the most, they are the marginalized group, and you're trying to empower them. And you're using strategies like either blended learning or lots of offline tasks, or peer groups that can work offline together. You are introducing mechanisms for those low resource contexts to be able to benefit from the MOOCs. So moving on, in my research, I have 3 key arguments. And the first one is that there is no one-size-fits-all framework to creating this justice-oriented MOOC. You might need to use justice as content, as pedagogy, or as process, which I'll highlight a bit later in the presentation. The second one is that course designers need to examine their own subjectivities and how this shapes their epistemological framing from the conception of the course. So it's a bit too late if you do it in the content of the course. When you are doing the course, you really need to examine your subjectivities at the beginning. And the third one is that greater emphasis when you're designing a course needs to be emphasized outside the construction of the course and curriculum. So what I mean by this is outside the content or the assessment or the pedagogy even that you talk about. Because you need to look at the surrounding factors of your MOOC participants. Who are they? What are their barriers? So you need to look at outside the MOOC in the real world before you get in. So I'm going to show you 4 guidelines to developing justice-oriented. Oh, sorry. Before I get to there, let me just talk about the 4 decision-making spheres. So in the framework that I've developed looks at framing the MOOC, conceptualizing the MOOC, situating the MOOC, and constructing and implementing the MOOC. Now that last level, constructing and implementing the MOOC, is often where everybody focuses. What is the content? What is the activities, the assessment, participation, those sorts of things, right? But the other aspects are the ones that are often neglected. So the first one is framing the MOOC production. So looking at when an institute takes up a MOOC platform, what are the rationales for choosing that one over another one? We then want to look at, for example, the limitations. If you choose one platform or another platform, who are you including? Who are you excluding? What pedagogies can you use in that platforms? And we look at the big ones here first, like Coursera, edX, FutureLearn. They have FutureLearn, for example, is much more social. It's much more discussion-based, whereas edX is a bit more sciencey. So you have to think about which platform you would want to use. Then we look at conceptualizing the MOOC, and this one I'll unpack in a bit more detail, where the designers need to reflect. And when I say designers, I mean it from the tech team, the instructional designers, that expert facilitator, that expert lecturer or facilitator. All of them need to examine their philosophical underpinnings about how they understand the world and how they understand the purpose of the MOOC and the target group. The third level is situating the MOOC. And this is where you need to look at technological accessibility of your participants, their language accessibility, what support do you need to provide to them, and how do you reach out to them through different awareness and advertising platforms. Now I will jump into 4 different guidelines. I usually take you through that whole rubric, but I know we have limited time today. So I've just chosen my 4 top tips for today. So the first one is that you need to include epistemically diverse stakeholders at the decision-making table of the MOOC design. So what do I mean by this? So from my research, what arose was that the more epistemically diverse the people who are at the decision-making table, the more inclusive the MOOC will be, as they're the ones who will set the ethos of the MOOC. So what we learn from this is a MOOC designers' identities, who they are, what they value, how they understand the world. It strongly influences the MOOC at all stages. So for example, in some of the MOOCs that I reviewed, one of the MOOC designers had a daughter who had disabilities, learning disabilities. And so that MOOC designer sought to ensure that the course was open and inclusive to other learners with disabilities. Similarly, we had a few Black female MOOC designers that I interviewed, and the way they sought to adapt the MOOC to ensure that this group was represented was really, really interesting. That another MOOC designer wouldn't be able to do. Now, then you would say, well, I can't be, it's about my identity, so I can't be everything. How do I tackle this? And this is the idea that gaps in perspectives need to be filled through inviting different people from different perspectives to speak. So you might want to invite other experts. If you are an academic, you might want to invite more industry practitioners to your MOOCs. You might want to get teaching assistants that are in touch with the types of participants in the group to partake in the MOOC formulation. And especially you might want to partner with organizations and practitioners that can allow voices beyond academic space to be included in a MOOC, because MOOCs tend to arise from academic spaces, and they might skip over things that are relevant and practical and grounded. And this is also keeping in touch with the skills and the relevance to people's lives. So the next is looking at these philosophical underpinnings. So MOOC designers need to make explicit their philosophical underpinnings, their assumptions, and the preconceived notions. And now, it doesn't mean that if you, for example, I say here, what agendas are being promoted or countered. An agenda doesn't need to be a negative thing, but you need to make it explicit. So what is your MOOC standing up for? Is it arguing for the rights of learners with disabilities? What is it? Is it taking a specific stance in a philosophical debate? You need to understand what is your agenda. And, you know, even topics like science and engineering have different debates. And you need to understand what is your agenda that you are promoting in this. What is that worldview that you are coming from? For example, is there a secular worldview embedded in what you teach? Is there a religious worldview, or is there, different components? Is there a political worldview that is being represented in your work? So we need to examine these underlying philosophical assumptions and the agendas that are promoted in looking at it. For example, even looking at what school of thought. In many, philosophical debates, you have different schools of thought. So you need to understand what that is. There are often different pedagogical approaches, instructivist, behaviorist, social constructivists. As a teacher and a designer, what pedagogical assumptions do you take in your design? Now, looking at the second one, use different justice-orientated techniques to address different injustices in the learning environment. So the first one is justice as content. So let's take my context, for example, in South Africa. If you were trying to design a course on on something, you would want to use the local environment, the local languages, local speakers, to ensure that the course is contextually relevant, right? Or make sure that you draw on the histories of that country. But once you take a MOOC online and you want it to be global, you can't make sure that you have a little bit of Brazilian history and a little bit of Spanish history and Thai history. You can't get everybody into the content. That's you know, not achievable and not even desirable. So here then you switch over to justice as pedagogy, where you have to work with the participants to bring in different aspects and contents from different angles. So they would, through interactivity and co-creation, critical thinking, bring in different ideas to the space that can represent different worldviews. Now, the third one is justice as process. And this looks at ensuring that the stakeholders who are designing the MOOC are diverse and plural, and include those from different cultures into that decision-making process. And this needs to be done in the conceptualization of the MOOC when you're deciding what to do, but also in its implementation as well. So the third point is ensure that the MOOC's purpose aligns with the target participants' needs. So what do we mean by that? So here are different purposes of MOOCs, right? So you get a teaching showcase. This could be a celebrity instructor, you know, someone who is really popular and you want to show this specific, you know, make a MOOC that spotlights the specific instructor. It could be a specific methodology that your university uses or specific technical skills. So that would be a teaching showcase. Then you have gateway skills. Are you trying to support learners that are switching from higher school into the university, and you want to give them a taster of what a future course could be like? Or are you supporting current students who, for example, need more support in writing or methodology? Then you have graduate literacies, which then looks at, for example, if a master's student is trying to write something or needs support in a subject-specific support, it might be graduate literacies, like, for example, research methods in engineering. You then have the topic of workplace skills, and this could be vocational skills from, you know, workplace health and safety, to advocacy, to journalism, or it could be like professional development, results-based project management, for example. And the last one is a research showcase. And this looks at a specific topic that your university or your department might be interested in, for example, climate change or systems dynamics or teaching for change. So it's a specific content that you want to share with, you know, the rest of the country or the rest of the world. Now, those are the different types of topics, but you also have different types of target groups, and you need to think about how do you design appropriately for that target group. You can have marginalized learners, and you should always consider that in any course, you would have marginalized learners. They could be from rural areas, from war zones, from disaster-struck areas, people who are marginalized through socioeconomic inequality. Then you have the prospective students, like we mentioned, prospective graduates. And then you have current students, current academics, professionals, people who are looking for a job, may want to do a MOOC to get the skills that they need to be able to find a job. So work seekers are a big group. And the last one is actually just knowledge seekers. Like you just find that someone's just interesting. Oh, I want to learn about a bit more about science or history, and they're just doing it for their own interest or self-development or their own well-being. Now, when we look at this, we also look at the target group by their context, right? So they might have different family or parental responsibilities. They might have different financial responsibilities. They might have different work and travel commitments. Their job might require them to travel hours to get to their desk, which means that they have less time. And then you have to design your course to make sure that they can, you know, catch these 10-minute videos throughout the day or something. people have different literacy levels. So you have to make sure that you design the course for the person who has the least digital literacy levels to make it usable for them. People have different access to devices, different language proficiencies, different cultural norms and religious views, different political views. So you need to consider all of these factors when you think about who are the people that you're speaking to. And that you can often forget that when you're in a MOOC and there are like, thousands of people and you just, say my participants, not understanding the uniqueness of each and one of them. Now, the last one is looking at different digital pedagogies to achieve different learning objectives. So here we have just 6 different pedagogies that can be used in the digital space. And what we do is we often focus on the first one, which is Instructivist Approaches, meaning we record a video and then we put it online, and then we might have a little chat after that. But that's just a unidirectional approach to teaching. And I'm sure many of you are teachers here, and you know that in a classroom, you would want to bring in many different elements to teaching. So there's Constructivist Approaches, which is more about inquiry-based learning, where you support the learner to construct their own knowledge. There's social constructivist approaches, where you want to ensure that the participants are interacting with each other to learn. And that was where we said justice as pedagogy. How can you ensure that learners can switch assignments or talk to each other, make breakout groups, use all of these social constructivist techniques in your MOOC to ensure that students are learning from each other. You then have Socratic approaches. And this was used in one MOOC that I thought was really interesting, where it's an ideas of exchanges and provocations and viewpoints. And the participants are encouraged to challenge and question the lecturer and, disprove them and have this discussion and this debate and this role play. And that's how you can learn in that way, even through a MOOC. You then have liberationist approaches, where the core goal is to build up this critical consciousness that then empowers teachers and actually empowers teachers to become teachers of their teachers. And that is done through these reflective processes and exercises where we can flip the boat and have student-led teaching. For example, if they can create blogs or videos or, snippets to present to others. And lastly, you have connectivist approaches, which is then looking at not just learning in the boundaries of a traditional MOOC, but looking at CMOOCs and how you can use Twitter and I don't know if everybody uses TikTok or whatever these other social network approaches are to learn through your broader network. So the last one is to just look here at the varying types of content. And again, trying to shift away from that pre-recorded video to looking at how to use animation, how to use podcasts, reading materials, linking to different web pages, WhatsApp groups. WhatsApp groups have been a very key thing in MOOCs, because a lot of the groups that we looked at, actually, if they create a WhatsApp group with a smaller cohort where they're actually comfortable messaging and asking questions, they can learn a lot more, because that discussion board that is on a MOOC is often just too busy, too cluttered, and it's almost like you shouting out in a crowded room and no one is hearing you. So trying to move away from that to bringing people to a space where they're comfortable interacting, and that can then increase the number of people that complete MOOCs. The second one is to vary the content types. So not just having recordings, but having scenarios or case studies, bringing in current affairs, having provocations, brainstorming. These are all elements that can be brought into your MOOC. And then the last one is looking at the varying the formative and the summative assessment. So not just assessing through a multiple choice quiz or sort of peer-to-peer assessment swapping, but looking at project-based or scenario-based sort of learning, photo stories, discussion and debate, bringing different ways of assessment into everything. So yes, that is where I want to conclude today. So I have some references and I'm happy to share it with the organizers, with all of you. And if you, I can also send this link in the chat of a resource of decolonizing EdTech resource list for tackling coloniality and digital neocolonialism in EdTech. So I'll stop there and open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taskeen Adam, for such a very fruitful presentation on the approach of designing justice-oriented MOOC that you're sharing with us today. I'm sure that we have a lot of lessons learned from this.
Well, many people have some comments and questions for you. So allow me to bring one, please, after you drink your water.
Thank you.
Okay. Professor Taskeen, okay, the first one, do the economy and social factors affect the justice in learning too? Once again, do the economy and social factors affect the injustice in learning too?
In learning tools?
In learning TOO.
Yes. Oh, most definitely. Those are probably the key factors. Especially with, what is it, economic, and what was the other one you mentioned?
Social factors.
Yeah, I mean, and we need to understand that, you know, economic factors don't just arise. There's a history of some groups that are marginalized due to different historical reasons. And so we don't just take a snapshot of someone, you know, being socioeconomically disadvantaged, but we look at the factors beyond that. So for example, in South Africa, it was systematic. Some people got more resources and some people got less resources. Some live in more areas with, you know, better infrastructure and connectivity. Others live in areas where they cannot get connectivity. So these are definitely factors that impact learning. If you are not living in an area that has good connectivity, how can you access online learning? So yeah, those are the great points.
Thank you so much. And I believe that many people ask for your slides, and I think you kindly share with us. So ladies and gentlemen, within about 1 week time, all the slides of all of our keynote speakers will be available on the conference website. Okay. So Dr. Taskeen, today I'm very touched by your presentation. A lot of details, a lot of things that we can learn from your talk. So I hope that next time perhaps you're going to be here in person, so we can even learn from you in the deeper understanding. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.